Welcome to our Friday update on the situation in Libya. I'm joined here, as you can see in Brussels, by Wing Commander Mike Bracken. Mike Bracken, our military spokesperson for Operation Unified Protector. Mike, welcome.
Thank you.
This week, allies and partners met in the North Atlantic Council to discuss progress in our operation to protect civilians in Libya, and I can tell you that there was a strong sense around the table. And the sense is our mission has been making a steady, tangible progress across the country. NATO nations and partners agree. We have taken the initiative. We have the momentum. Our mission remains unchanged. We will prevent attacks and threats against civilians until the threat is removed. And allies and partners agreed this week that the evidence shows we are doing just that. Gaddafi is finding it harder and harder to launch attacks. His forces are trying tactics which are more and more desperate because the ones they have already tried did not work. We are taking on Gaddafi forces whenever they pose a threat to civilians. NATO airstrikes against multiple Gaddafi regime targets on land and at sea last night provide just the latest example of that. And you will hear more details about that from Mike in a minute. The sense of isolation of the regime is increasing. As the Secretary General said yesterday in Slovakia and today in Rome, Gaddafi's time is up. We need to move on. We need a political process to accommodate the legitimate demands of the Libyan people. With that, I will hand over to Mike. Mike left the operational room this morning at 2 o'clock, and he has flown from Naples to be here in person with all of us and to give you a first-hand update of the last night's operations and also a much wider overview of the situation within Libya. So please be gentle to him because since he became a spokesperson, he hasn't slept much.
Okay, good afternoon. Before I begin my situational update, I'll brief you on the precision strikes which were carried out by NATO and coalition forces last night. NATO air assets continued their precision strikes against pro-Gaddafi regime forces in a coordinated operation against pro-Gaddafi maritime forces in the ports of Tripoli, Al-Qums, and Sirte. NATO hit 8 pro-Gaddafi warships. This video shows a Con-class frigate and a combatant fast patrol boat being engaged by NATO aircraft. At Qums, NATO hit a number of ribs in the maintenance facility. These ribs have been directly linked to the Masrata pro-Gaddafi maritime operations of recent days. As I have said before, this is a very complex campaign, and the decision to carry out last night's mission was reached after long and careful deliberation as a direct response to a serious change in military tactics by pro-Gaddafi forces. We have seen a significant and highly concerning increase in the activities of pro-Gaddafi maritime assets and a number of maritime engagements. Over the past couple of weeks, we have discovered pro-Gaddafi forces indiscriminately mining the approaches of Misrata harbour. In addition, on a further 3 occasions, NATO ships have intercepted pro-Gaddafi assets acting in a hostile manner. And just a few days ago, there was an incident where NATO interdicted a booby-trapped rib, leading to the discovery and subsequent destruction of 1 ton of explosives at sea. This escalation has not only caused further serious threats to the safety of civilians and the flow of desperately needed humanitarian aid, but these actions clearly demonstrated the intent of pro-Gaddafi forces to strike NATO and coalition maritime vessels. NATO has been alert and responsive to these calculated changes in tactics. I would like to emphasize 3 facts about NATO's operations that happened last night. Firstly, these were legal targets. They were all naval warships with no civilian utility and were targeted with the approval of NATO and coalition rules of engagement. Secondly, there was a clear and compelling military case for conducting last night's operations. Thirdly, NATO and its coalition partners have continued to use a number of communications channels to tell the pro-Gaddafi forces to lay down their arms and return to their bases and homes. We have been stepping up leaflet drops and radio broadcasts to the pro-Gaddafi forces, telling them to move away from their military equipment military installations, and maritime assets. Let me emphasize, this does not signal a change in strategy for NATO's operations. Our aim to protect the Libyan civilians remains the same. The commander's mandate under United Nations Security Council Resolution 1970 and 1973 is clear, and it allows him to use all necessary means to carry out his mission. The message from my commander, General Bouchard, has been consistent and clear. We will maintain the pressure and a high operational temper on any forces which are coordinating or launching attacks on the civilian population of Libya until our mission is achieved. Now I'd like to provide you with an operational overview of how the NATO mission has developed over the past couple of months. And as a navigator, what I would like to do is move from east to west. Let's start in the east. 2 months ago, the pro-Gaddafi forces were trying to seize Ashdabia. The city was under significant pressure and its inhabitants were being shelled by rocket launchers. NATO responded with day and night airstrikes, resulting in pro-Gaddafi forces scattering and hiding their larger weapons. By mid-April, Ashdabia was still under some pressure, but pro-Gaddafi forces were not able to launch direct attacks. However, they were carrying out reconnaissance patrols towards the city. There were some skirmishes, but the danger to civilians was greatly reduced, and humanitarian organizations started to move into the city, a sure sign that the situation was improving. Today, pro-Gaddafi forces still present a threat, but they are now in defensive positions in the vicinity of Brega. Consequently, pro-Gaddafi forces are now fixed and struggling to maintain their supply lines. There is no shelling at all on Ashdabia, and there is no obvious threat to Benghazi. Life has definitely improved for the inhabitants as a direct consequence of NATO's actions. More humanitarian aid organizations are working in the city, and a degree of relative normality has returned. Moving a little bit to the west, to Misrata. 2 months ago, Misrata was a city under siege. There were pro-Gaddafi tanks in the city centre, and the port was being shelled by pro-Gaddafi multiple rocket launchers. The city's inhabitants were suffering from indiscriminate attacks by artillery and rockets on a daily basis. There were thousands of distressed people living in appalling conditions by the port. The city was close to collapse. Once again, NATO airstrikes began destroying their tanks and rocket launchers, forcing the attackers to hide. A month later, the situation remained extremely serious, with many reports of civilian casualties and pro-Gaddafi forces shelling the rebel-held port in an attempt to disrupt the flow of humanitarian aid. At one point, humanitarian assistance was completely stopped for several days. Around 2 weeks ago, we reached a turning point. This coincided with NATO airstrikes that targeted pro-Gaddafi forces, cutting them off from resupplies of ammunition and additional weapons. The city is no longer under siege. There is no shelling on the port or the city centre. The city is now clear of pro-Gaddafi forces, and humanitarian aid flows freely into the port. I'm encouraged to report that the numbers of people wanting to flee the city in ships has dwindled from thousands to hundreds. Humanitarian aid continues to get into the city by ship, with at least 23 ships getting into the city in the last 25 days. Pro-Gaddafi forces have been forced to the outskirts of the town by opposition forces, and Misrata is calm. Let's move further west into the Berber highlands and the western side of the country. Here, the situation remains difficult and concerning for NATO. Pro-Gaddafi forces do not control the area, but they are putting the civilian, largely Berber population under significant pressure from shelling in Zafran, Zintan, Nalut, and the Wazin border crossing. As a consequence, many inhabitants have fled over the border to refugee camps in Tunisia, and there have been skirmishes between rebel and pro-Gaddafi forces, as well as pro-Gaddafi forces and Tunisian forces along the border. However, in the Berber-controlled areas, the rebels have resisted the pro-Gaddafi forces and now appear to be holding their ground. NATO is focused on decreasing the pressure on the population by striking pro-Gaddafi units, and this strategy is clearly working. Finally, moving to Tripoli. Here we have increased the pressure by striking military command and control centres. This has limited Gaddafi's ability to give orders to his forces. It has also constrained his freedom of movement. Effectively, he's gone into hiding. I have already briefed on the maritime operation. However, I reiterate that the escalation in pro-Gaddafi maritime activity has not only caused serious threats to the safety of civilians and the flow of humanitarian aid, it also demonstrated the intent of pro-Gaddafi forces to strike NATO and coalition maritime vessels. In sum, pro-Gaddafi forces no longer have enough combat power or logistics to carry out decisive attacks on rebel forces. Thanks to NATO airstrikes, their command and control is severely hampered, and their forces are finding it difficult to get resupplies. Today, the anti-Gaddafi forces are better organized. They continue to make gains. NATO's actions have resulted in dramatically fewer attacks on civilian populations in Libya, and pro-Gaddafi's capability is significantly reduced compared to when Operation Unified Protector began on the 31st of March. The commander's remit is clear. NATO and its partners will carry out the United Nations mandate until all attacks or threats of attack on the civilian population have ceased. That concludes my operational update and my update on the strikes that occurred last night. Thank you.